Hello and welcome to day one of cannabinoids, marijuana and the brain. So today I'll be talking a lot about the history and background of cannabinoids and the marijuana plant and its use in society. And then we'll start getting into the biochemical neuroscience details of how it acts in the brain. All right, so here's the roadmap. I guess I already kind of told you this, but we'll go ahead and start by talking about the changing views on marijuana use in society, in at least Western society, and then some of the good and the bad news about marijuana use and cannabinoid use, potential applications and applications, the propensity or possibility of addiction, overdosing, and just general issues there. Then going into some of the history of use, and then diving into the chemical neuroscience background about cannabinoids and how they work in the brain and what makes them unique and interesting. All right, and then next week we'll cover more on this, but more really diving deeper into the neuroscience and neurobiology, talking more about the brain, the synapse, how it impacts learning, and the potential connections and how it's connected to schizophrenia. All right, on the whole, I'm just going to ask some questions. I don't have the real-time clicker ability anymore given the COVID-19 situation, but this just gives you some questions here to think about. So just to kind of get your brain going here, on the whole, what do you have? What's your opinion here? Do you think that marijuana use has a net positive effect on society? Does it have a net negative effect on society? Or do you think it's either way? It's kind of neutral. On the whole, it kind of balances out. There's no net positive or net negative effect. It's kind of balanced. The positives and negatives equally balance each other out. All right. Yeah, so think about that. And now, what do you think about the recreational, non-medical use? Should it be legal or illegal? And then if you do think it should be legal, what level of regulation should its use have? Should it be unregulated, that anybody should be able to use it? Should it be loosely regulated, like alcohol, where you need a driver's license, for example, and be 21 or older? Or should it be given only with a prescription from a doctor? So what level do you think you'd be most comfortable with it being regulated? And just generally, what do you think that smoking pot makes you lazy? Yes or no? You have no idea, or you're just too darn lazy to even think about it. And how do you believe that marijuana affects memory? Do you think it improves memory? Does it impair memory? Or that it has really no effect on memory? And do you know somebody in your social circle, who has what you would consider a serious problem with marijuana use, where it negatively affects their life or their social connections? What do you think? Do you have somebody in your social circle that you would say maybe has an abuse problem? All right. With that said, now that you thought about those questions, let's look at some of the numbers, at least mostly for the US. Where are the opinions and how have they evolved over time as to for questions like legalization and such? So here's some data. The links are below or connected with the data here. Public opinion on legalizing marijuana. This is up to 2017. So you can see that the general opinion over time, here, let me get my little pointer out. I'm on this plot right here. All right, you can see the general opinion over time has evolved. Back in 1969, again, society was definitely in major upheaval at the time. Recovering, you were still going through a bit of the 60s and the drugs kind of lifestyle there. But 84% of the population, which is higher than I would have expected, 84% really thought their marijuana use should be illegal. Only 12% thought it should be legal. I guess the rest are undecided. All right. So that you can see has had its ups and downs, but then around 2010-ish, it actually flipped where the majority of people in the United States are now in favor of legalizing marijuana. That's a pretty interesting cultural shift, and it's been a pretty stable increase since 1990. So clearly it might be just keep going up. So that is the current evolving opinion, and those opinions have changed by generation. So as you see in the next plot to the right, that these opinions have been more, actually the opinions you might maybe expect, the opinions for legalization are more prevalent amongst millennials, the younger generation, as opposed to the older generation. A pretty clear relationship. You have millennials and Gen X and the boomers, so it just goes by the year of birth, effectively, as to the opinion of legalization. All right, so these views are changing. The number of, and they're changing along with the number of people who use marijuana. So it was grown from 2002 to 2014. It's all the data that I had in that statistic, was that the numbers have increased about 10 million. So from 21 million to 31 million people are using marijuana in the United States. That's a lot of millions. And 69% of high school seniors do not view marijuana smoking in general as harmful, but still a majority of about the same amount of those students say that they do disapprove of regular marijuana smoking. Now, so doing it once in a while, it's fine, but perhaps they're seeing like regular use might be a little detrimental. Okay, so prevalence of use and abuse is increasing. So cannabis use is the most widely used illegal drug in the planet. So it's very widely used, as maybe is not surprising. Interestingly, the use of synthetic cannabinoids, so not from the plant, but from a chemical plant, so utterly synthetic cannabinoid drugs that are based or inspired by the structure of the molecules in the plant, that use is down. Interestingly, in the US, the abuse potential, so abuse independence of the drug of marijuana or cannabis is around 4.4%. I'll talk more about that later. That is much less than, let's say, alcohol or opioid abuse, but it's still a big number when you consider that we have over 50 million people in the US. College students and vaping. So you can, of course, vape cannabinoids as well as smoking the traditional cigarette or a bong or so. But vaping use prevalence, this is lifetime, as if you tried it once or so. Lifetime cannabis vaping prevalence is around 20%. That doesn't mean you're a regular user, it just means you might have tried it. All right. And let's say comparing this to alcohol, binge, and this is in college students, so maybe most relevant to you guys. Binge drinking in alcohol is around 35%. Heavy drinking prevalence is around 12%. And so the vaping use is pretty high relative to that, but that doesn't mean it's abused. So the abuse in college students isn't nearly as high as the binge drinking or heavy drinking use. All right. High school students. Now, this is perhaps an issue that very young individuals are starting to use marijuana. We really don't know very much how marijuana, THC, CBD, some of the active ingredients in marijuana, affect the younger brain. But prevalence is still relatively high. Around 7% of high school students have used, maybe just once or twice, or some are regular users, cannabis. All right. Okay, so where does cannabis use stack up at the state and international levels with regard to the law? So it's interesting. So I had to update this slide from last year because these numbers keep increasing. So I think I had it in the 20s, 28 or something like that last year. Well, the the number of states in the United States that have legalized marijuana use for medical purposes is now up to 33. So the majority of U.S. states. Now, number that have now legalized it for recreational use is up to 11. So yes, these are very high numbers, I think. Well, let's compare two to our neighbor. So marijuana has been legal for medical use in all of Canada since 2001. So they've definitely gone all the way with the medical use of marijuana. Back to the United States, though, marijuana use is still illegal and criminal and a federal offense a felony at the U.S. federal level. So that's the strange ambiguity we're in with our situation where the states can have one law that is pretty much in direct conflict with the federal law. All right. Now, if you want to see a good video from this fantastic video site, and if you've tried it before, it's Kursgesat. I'm probably mispronouncing that. It's a German site, German developed site, and it means in a nutshell or in brief. And there are these wonderful little short video segments that give information on everything from marijuana legalization to black holes to quantum dynamics to time travel to philosophy. It's really a great site to just learn about any number of things in a short, fun, animated way. So I'd highly recommend checking out the Kursgesat website. And again, sorry to the Germans out there who I butchered the pronunciation of that, but that is a really, really interesting site. Okay, so with regard to actual arrests, and so the majority of arrests are for people who have relatively very small amounts of pot found on them. That can be abused, and we'll talk about the kind of institutional racism component of that in a moment. But that's a huge amount of effort that our police force are putting into, or at least arrests that are being boiled down to people who have relatively small amounts of marijuana on them. So yeah, 52% of all drug arrests in 2010 were for marijuana. I mean, that's just an incredible, incredible number. Well, I guess maybe it's not that incredible considering that it is globally the most widely used illicit drug ever. So I guess 52% of all drug arrests maybe isn't as surprising as I initially thought, but that's still a huge amount for this one particular drug. And so if it was legalized, it's interesting. That whole number would be erased and go down to 0. All right. There's a myth out there that I guess is worth debunking here related to that statistic. Is that, yes, a lot of these arrests are essentially for marijuana possession or small amounts, but there's this myth that prisons are filled with people who have been arrested for possession. But that's really not the case. It's not true at all, actually. Only about maybe 1% of inmates are actually in jail for possession of marijuana. Usually it's for something else, some combination of other things, but not for possession alone. All right, so why is the federal government or our state police still spending so much time arresting people with marijuana? Well, because marijuana is itself a Schedule I narcotic, according to the schedules that we talked about, which means it is still listed as having no medical use and therapeutic use, and is just a dangerous drug altogether. Now we're studying that is what Schedule I means, and so it's still listed as that at the federal level. Obviously, many states and a growing number of scientists disagree, but that is where we are at the federal level. So yes, despite being legalized in 33 states and the fact that about 60% of Americans do support legalization. So there's some problems with that kind of disconnect between the federal and state levels. One is it creates some uncertainty as people don't know if they will or won't get arrested or fired, as it could be. As it's up to the feds or the state whether or not you'll get arrested or not for possession, and up to the local police that happen to pull you over. you could get arrested again by the feds if it is even in a state where it is legal. All right. This also creates some problems because it is illegal. There's no way for things like the FDA or other type of inspection agencies to actually monitor the quality and consistency of marijuana that's distributed to the public for consumption. So there's notoriously bad labeling in marijuana out there. You might go to a, quote, trusted marijuana dispensary, but there's no way we know for sure if they tell you that, oh, this particular marijuana has this % of THC versus CBD or so. You'd never know if that's truly the case because there's no real enforcement or inspection out there. All right. And also there are some concerns too in some reports that some of the CBD or some of the cannabinoids that are being distributed contain fairly high amounts of pesticides. So hopefully there will be some either voluntary or ultimately some kind of top-down investigation or inspections that will help make sure that people taking this, if they won't be smoking in pesticides. It's never good. All right. And then the fact that it's still ambiguous whether it's legal or not does open the doors, just like Prohibition era, where you can support effectively organized or criminal enterprises to get people their supplies. So it does kind of feed into that environment. All right, institutional racism. All right, so yes, we know that there are a lot of arrests for possession, but the likelihood of being arrested for possession is much, much higher if you happen to be black. So almost 4 times higher to be arrested for marijuana possession if you're black relative to whites. And so there is this big concern, and a real concern backed up with the numbers, that it kind of feeds into institutional racism. And the fact that you have this arrest and perhaps get something on your criminal record, even if you don't do any jail time, is that it's a permanent mark on your criminal record. And that makes getting a job difficult, let alone having a career. And certain types of careers are completely off limits to somebody who may have a record of at least even a small amount of possession. All right. So now let's switching to some of the pros and the cons for marijuana use. And definitely it's a mixed bag on both sides. All right. So there is some evidence that marijuana in moderate amounts can help treat chronic pain and migraines. We have some scientific work on that. It definitely has been used for a while, for a long time, for helping treat nausea. So it's anti-nausea and anti-vomiting. And it has been used to treat nausea in cancer patients receiving chemotherapy. As you might have heard, marijuana can give you the munchies, make you hungry. And that could be good for people undergoing chemotherapy who lose the desire to eat. That's a very common situation. It may help, and this is still under investigation, because the marijuana or the cannabinoid, there are many cannabinoid receptors in your immune system, in your body, and in your brain. And it might protect against inflammation. And inflammation is your body's kind of ability to fight off infection, but when it's out of control, it seems to be at the heart of many nasty diseases like Alzheimer's disease, AIDS, encephalopathy, traumatic brain injury, MS. So these all seem to have neuroinflammation as a core component of the pathology, and reducing that is a good thing. So it may help with that. Glaucoma, so that's eye issues. It's debated. There was initial evidence, or at least support, that it may help with glaucoma, but now that seems that might not be the case, because the effects of marijuana to relieve or reduce blood pressure in the eye appears to be very temporary. And so it might not be very helpful in the long run, but there was some early evidence on that. So if you've heard that glaucoma can be treated with marijuana, I'd be a little more skeptical about that right now. Now, there is ongoing work and some evidence. It's early though, but it's still a lot of anecdotal and some work now in animal models that marijuana, or at least CBD, not the psychoactive component, but the kind of the counter to the psychoactive component, cannabidiol, CBD, might help reduce neural excitability and reduce epilepsy. And so could very well lead to some new drugs or its use for treating epilepsy. And another pro is, yeah, it's recreational. I mean, alcohol, it clearly has no medicinal benefit at all, but it makes people generally hang out and enjoy the life with each other. So I guess you can't discount that as being a pro. And yes, it makes people laugh at stupid stuff. So that's not a bad thing as well. All right. On the negative side, there are many potential cons, especially if you have, for example, certain genetic predispositions. If you have a family history or a genetic predisposition to schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, there's definitely very repeated correlational evidence that you should not take marijuana because it's associated with the onset of a schizophrenia episode or the schizophrenia condition if you have that genetic predisposition. So consider your family history. All right. In general, there's a growing evidence that if you take it when you're very young, this may not be great. So waiting a bit before you start using, or at least heavy using of marijuana for medical or non-medical reasons, you might want to push that off until you're past your teens at least, as it could be a bad idea. There's some evidence that early use might reduce IQ. Again, this evidence is early because scientific investigation has been stymied essentially by making it a Schedule I narcotic. It's just slowed everything down. All right, we do know that acute marijuana use clearly impairs memory and motor control, and can seriously impair your driving. Just definitely don't drive after you've done used cannabis. In men, it appears to decrease testosterone and sperm counts. Let's see, it's not smoking anything, pretty much, is not great for your lungs. Don't do it if you're concerned about your lung health. At least doing it regularly might be a bad thing. There's bronchitis risk increases for chronic pot smokers especially. All right. There are very few, unfortunately, large clinical trials, so we don't know so much. And many claims, but there are many claimed medical benefits because it's a very profitable industry. And now that it's legalized, there are many companies doing quite well with legalization, but they may oversell their product and claim all of these benefits. But many of those claims might be from very preliminary studies or not from studies at all, and so they may not indeed pass any placebo controls. And overdosing can be a problem given that the new strains of marijuana that you can get at dispensaries or not, just that you can get on the street, have much higher concentrations of THC relative to the older strains from 5-10 years ago. Overdosing is a problem. It's not lethal because it's a relatively safe drug. Nobody that I know of has, from any of the data, has died from an overdose, but it's definitely not fun. So that is a con. All right, with the javelinas, I will end this segment.